James River Valley, South Dakota, October 1903. The prairie grass was bleached to the color of old bone, and the wind had a new edge to it, a promise of the iron-hard winter to come. On his newly claimed quarter section, Mihkel Tammik was not raising a house. He was digging a hole. It was not a foundation, not a cellar, but a vast rectangular pit, 40 feet long and 20 feet wide. Day after day, the metallic scrape of his shovel and the rhythmic thud of earth hitting the growing mounds were the only sounds to break the wind's ceaseless monologue. His neighbors, sensible men who had raised their standard frame cabins board by painstaking board, would stop their wagons on the trail to watch. They saw a man digging his own grave. "He's gone prairie mad," said Jedediah Crane to his son, reining in his horses. "Seen it before. The sky gets too big, and the man gets too small." Silas Blackwood, whose land bordered Tammik's to the east, was more direct. "That man is a fool. Come January, the ground will freeze 10 feet down and squeeze that hole shut with him and his family inside. He's burying them alive." The talk in the nearby settlement of Huron was much the same. This strange Estonian, a man who spoke little and smiled less, was not building. He was burrowing. Then the corrugated iron arrived on a flatbed wagon, great curved sheets that glittered in the low autumn sun. Mihkel began assembling them inside the pit, bolting the arches together until a long, metallic humpback whale lay in the earth. The structure's peak barely crested the prairie's surface. It was this bizarre sight that greeted Cleavon Halverson, the claim adjuster for the Dakota Land and Surety Company. Halverson was a man of rules and measurements, of load-bearing walls and roof pitches. He stepped out of his buggy, his notepad already in hand, and stared at the half-buried metal tube. He walked to the edge of the pit, his polished shoes gathering dust. "Mr. Tammik," he called out, his voice carrying the easy authority of a man who could sign away another man's future. Mihkel looked up from the trench, his face smudged with dirt. "I am Cleavon Halverson. My report is necessary to validate your homestead claim for the loan." He gestured with his pen at the hole. "I'm afraid this will not do. The Homestead Act has clear requirements for a habitable dwelling. It requires walls of a certain height, a permanent foundation. This is a culvert. It's a root cellar with windows. I cannot in good faith approve it." The unspoken threat hung in the air. Change it or lose everything. The mockery of neighbors was one thing. A man could ignore whispers carried on the wind. But the calm, bureaucratic certainty of Cleavon Halverson was another. It was the voice of the system that owned the land, the bank, and the deed. What did this quiet Estonian root cellar mason, a man whose hands knew the heft of fieldstone and the damp chill of earth below the frost line, understand about the deep physics of the prairie that a trained claim adjuster, a man who judged frontier structures for a living, had missed? Stick with me, and I promise you will learn the profound difference between insulation and thermal mass, between fighting the cold and borrowing warmth from the one place the Dakota winter can never touch. We look at a house and see walls that keep the cold out. Mihkel Tammik saw a planet-sized battery waiting to be plugged into. If you find these stories of forgotten ingenuity valuable, please consider subscribing to our channel and letting us know in the comments. Have you ever lived in a place that used the earth for heating or cooling? We'd love to hear about it. Mihkel Tammik was not a carpenter. He was not a plainsman. He arrived in South Dakota with his wife, Elina, and their two small children, Jan and Lena, with little more than a government pamphlet and a memory of a different kind of cold. The Estonian winter was deep and dark, but it was a forest cold, a cold buffered by trees and moderated by the nearby sea. The Dakota winter was something else entirely. It was a physical presence, an aggressor. Their first winter, in 1902, was spent in a hastily erected frame cabin, identical to all the others that dotted the landscape. It was a miserable education in the limits of milled lumber. The house was a creature of the cold. At night, they lay under every blanket they owned and listened to it die. The green wood, shrinking in the desiccated air, made the structure tick and groan at every nail, a sound like the frantic clicking of 1,000 frozen insects. During the day, a constant, furious fire in the cast-iron stove could barely keep the single room above 40 degrees. Away from the stove, your breath plumed in the air. Alina's salt, stored in a wooden box in what passed for a cellar, clumped into a useless, damp rock. The matches in the tin box by the stove grew limp and snapped in half when struck, the sulfur heads refusing to spark. It was a damp, clinging cold, a cold that worked its way into the very fibers of their lives. Little Lena developed a cough that rattled in her chest for 3 straight months. They survived, but only just. Mihkel knew they would not survive another winter like that. He knew the wood stove was a liar. It burned through their precious cordwood with monstrous appetite, yet the heat it produced was fleeting. A temporary victory in a war that was lost the moment the fire sank to embers. Back in his home province of Järvamaa, Mihkel had not built houses. He was a mason who specialized in clamps, the ingenious Estonian root cellars. He was a man who worked with the earth, not on top of it. His hands knew the weight and feel of granite fieldstone, the precise angle of a berm, the way to lay a dry stack wall that would hold back a literal ton of damp soil. He understood that below the frost line, the earth held a quiet, steady coolness in summer and, more importantly, a reservoir of gentle, unwavering warmth in winter. It was a different kind of thinking. A prairie carpenter saw a flat, empty space and asked, "What can I build on this?" Mihkel Tammik looked at the same prairie and asked, "What can I build in this?" That first brutal winter had not broken him. It had focused him. He would not build another wooden box to shiver in. He would build what he knew. He would build a harbor in the earth. The failure of the standard prairie cabin was not a failure of craftsmanship. The men who built them were skilled and hardworking. It was a failure of physics. A wooden house on the plains is an island in an ocean of lethal cold. It has no anchor. The problem wasn't the cold, precisely. The problem was exposure. Every square foot of a conventional cabin's walls, floor, and roof was in direct contact with the punishing environment. In a typical Dakota winter, the outside air temperature might be minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit. The thin wooden walls, perhaps with a layer of tar paper, offered minimal resistance. Heat, measured in British thermal units or BTUs, bled from the interior at a catastrophic rate. The stove was not heating the house, it was fighting a losing battle against the entire South Dakota sky. The primary mechanism of this failure was the complete lack of geothermal coupling. The ground just a few feet below the surface was a world away from the air. At a depth of 8 feet, the earth in the James River Valley maintains a remarkably stable temperature year-round, hovering around 48 degrees Fahrenheit. This is the planet's thermal mass at work, a colossal, slow-moving reservoir of energy. The standard cabin, sitting on shallow stone footings or even just wooden posts, was thermally disconnected from this reservoir. Its floor was a battlefield, with 40-degree indoor air on one side and 10-degree frozen ground just inches below. For families like the Jorgensens, 2 miles to the north, this meant a life dictated by the woodpile. They needed to burn a full cord of wood every 2 weeks just to keep the house survivable. Their children slept in their coats, huddled near the stove. Ice formed in crystalline ferns on the inside of the window panes, and, in the north-facing bedroom, on the heads of the nails in the walls, each one a tiny conduit of cold piped directly into the room. The problem wasn't insulation. The problem was contact. They were trying to warm a tiny pocket of air while it was touching a universe of cold on all 6 sides. Mihkel understood this in his bones. The solution wasn't a bigger fire. The solution was to remove most of the sides. The construction that so baffled his neighbors was a model of brutal efficiency. After digging the pit, an arduous task that took him the better part of 3 weeks, with only a shovel and a wheelbarrow, the real work began. He hired a team of horses to drag the curved iron sheets into the depression. Working with Alina, he bolted them together, section by section, starting from the middle and working outwards. The corrugated metal, designed for military barracks and storage sheds, was cheap, strong, and readily available from the railroad depot in Huron. He had spent almost all of their savings on the 22 arched sections of steel, costing him a total of $168. To his neighbors, it was an astonishing waste of money on what looked like a drainage pipe. Silas Blackwood, leaning on the fence line, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. A man could build a proper 2-story house for that money, Tammik. A house with a porch. What in God's name are you building? Mihkel, tightening a bolt until his knuckles were white, did not look up. A warm place, he said. Once the main arch was assembled, he turned his attention to the ends. He framed them with thick timbers, leaving openings for a single door and 2 small double-paned windows on the south face. On the north face, there were no openings at all. Then came the most crucial part, the part that drew on his Estonian knowledge. Using the earth he had excavated, he began to build up the berms. He didn't just pile the dirt against the metal, he packed it, tamped it down, creating dense, engineered walls of soil that rose up the sides of the arch, leaving only the top 4 feet of the curve exposed to the air. This was the moment Cleven Halverson chose for his second visit. The claim adjuster stood with his hands on his hips, watching as Mihkel and Alina worked together, compacting the soil with heavy wooden tampers. "Mr. Tammik," Halverson began, his tone less accusatory now, more genuinely perplexed. "I filed my preliminary report and my superiors are concerned. As I told you, a structure must have walls of a certain height to be deemed habitable under the Act. Your walls, sir, are made of dirt, and the structure itself is mostly underground. This is a cellar with a roof. I have to be clear. As it stands, your claim could be voided. You could lose this land." Mihkel paused his work, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a dirty glove. He looked at the claim adjuster, then at the half-buried arch, then back. He spoke a single, quiet sentence. "It will be warm." He then returned to his work, leaving Halverson standing alone on the prairie. The final element was the most elegant. Along the very apex of the arch, Mihkel cut a long, narrow opening, and over it he built a raised wooden frame with a continuous strip of glass running its length. This was his clear story. It was not for looking out of. It was for letting light in, deep into the heart of the long structure. It was the only part of the design that acknowledged the sky. To Jedediah Crane, it was the final madness. Cutting a hole in the top of his only roof, the man is inviting the snow to bury him. But Mihkel knew light was as important as warmth for surviving the winter darkness. The physics behind Mihkel's sunken arch were both simple and profound. He had replaced the losing battle of insulation with the winning strategy of thermal coupling. His home wasn't so much a barrier against the cold as it was an extension of the deep earth. Let's talk numbers. The total surface area of a conventional cabin similar in size might be around 1,200 square feet. Walls, floor, and roof, all exposed to the brutal Dakota air. Mihkel's structure, by being sunk 8 feet and having the sides bermed, had radically altered that equation. The only parts of his home truly exposed to the winter air were the two end walls and the very top of the arch. By his calculation, he had reduced his exposed surface area by nearly 70%. 70% of his house was no longer fighting the -20-degree air. It was having a constant, gentle conversation with the 48-degree Earth. This is geothermal coupling. The Earth acts as a massive heat sink in the summer, and crucially, a heat source in the winter. Source is perhaps the wrong word. The 48-degree ground is not warm like a fire is warm, but compared to the lethal cold of the air, it is a boundless reservoir of mildness. Every square foot of Mihkel's buried walls was constantly being pulled toward that 48-degree equilibrium. Instead of losing hundreds of BTUs per hour to the outside, the walls were either losing very few or, in some cases, actively gaining a tiny amount of heat from the surrounding soil. The berms he had so carefully constructed served a dual purpose. They were insulation, yes. A thick layer of earth is a decent, if not spectacular, insulator. But more importantly, they were thermal mass. They added tons of stable material to the structure's envelope, slowing down any temperature change to a geological crawl. A sudden cold snap that would knife through a wooden cabin in minutes would take days to have a noticeable effect on the interior of Mihkel's home. Cleavon Halverson saw a cellar. Mihkel had built a battery. The corrugated iron was merely the container. The real structure was the tons of stable, 48-degree soil it was embedded in. His small wood stove would not have to fight the entire Dakota winter. It would only need to nudge the interior temperature up from the baseline of 48 degrees to a comfortable 65 or 70. It was the difference between heating a house and merely topping it off. The clear story on the roof was another piece of subtle genius. By placing it at the apex, he ensured that sunlight, even the weak, low-angled light of winter, could penetrate the full length of the interior, reducing the need for lamps and providing a psychological bulwark against the seasonal gloom. He wasn't ignoring the sky. He was merely choosing how to interact with it, for light, not for a fight over heat. That winter announced its arrival with a particular prairie cruelty. It began not with snow, but with rain. For 7 straight days in early December, a persistent, super-cool drizzle fell from a gunmetal sky. It was a Dakota silver thaw. The rain froze the instant it touched any surface. Tree branches grew heavy, then thick, then grotesquely swollen with clear ice until they groaned and snapped with reports like rifle shots. The prairie grass became a field of glittering glass needles. Every fence post, every strand of barbed wire wore a 2-inch thick armor of ice. The world became beautiful, crystalline, and impossibly dangerous. Then, on the 8th day, the sky cleared and the temperature plunged. It fell to 10 below zero by nightfall, and by the next morning, it was -24 degrees Fahrenheit, with a wind that honed the cold to a razor's edge. For the homesteaders in their wooden cabins, the silver thaw was a disaster. The ice sealed every crack and crevice, stopping the drafts, but it also encased their homes in a shell of profound cold. The Jorgensen's roof, laden with hundreds of pounds of ice, began to sag ominously. Silas Blackwood found his livestock frozen standing in their lean-to, their bodies encased in the same clear armor as the trees. The smoke rising from the chimneys of the frame houses looked thin and weary, whipped away instantly by the wind, a testament to the furious, inefficient burning happening below. From a distance, the Tammik homestead was an anomaly. A steady, almost lazy plume of white smoke rose from its small chimney pipe, a confident signal in the frozen air. But the truly strange sight was the arch itself. In a world uniformly coated in a thick, glittering sheath of ice, the dark curve of Mihkel's roof was bare. It was wet, with meltwater trickling down its sides to freeze on the ground below. But the arch itself wore no ice. The gentle, constant leakage of heat from within, coupled with the immense thermal stability of the earth beneath it, was just enough to warm the metal skin above freezing. The rain had run off before it could glaze over. It was a single, dark, living curve in a white, frozen world. Inside, the difference was not academic. It was absolute. While the Millers huddled around their stove, burning precious wood just to keep their kitchen at 40 degrees, the Tammik home was a steady 65 degrees. Elena was teaching John to read at the long wooden table. Little Lena, her cough long gone, played on a sheepskin rug on the floor, her cheeks rosy with health, not fever. There were no drafts. The air was still and quiet. The only sound was the gentle hiss of the small fire in the stove and the murmur of Elena's voice. They were not surviving. They were living. Cleven Halverson was a man who believed in the tangible. He believed in ledgers, in survey lines, in the provable fact of a well-built wall. The silver thaw and the subsequent freeze provided him with an abundance of facts to record. He spent 2 days traveling his territory, documenting cracked foundations, collapsed roofs, and lost livestock. It was grim work. On the 3rd day of the deep freeze, he was on the trail heading toward the Blackwood claim when it happened. The trail, like everything else, was a sheet of corrugated ice. The buggy's wheel hit a rut, and with a sound like a pistol shot, the rear axle, made brittle by the extreme cold, snapped clean in two. The buggy lurched and collapsed, throwing Halverson into a frozen snowdrift. He was unhurt, but stranded. The nearest town was 8 miles away. His horse was skittish, and he was improperly dressed for a long walk in such conditions. The wind was relentless, sucking the heat from his body with shocking speed. He was in real danger. He scanned the horizon. To the east, nothing. To the north, the faint, desperate wisp of smoke from the Jorgensen place, nearly 3 miles distant. But to the west, closer, perhaps only a mile, was a stronger, steadier plume of smoke. It was coming from the strange, sunken house of the Estonian. He began to walk, his leg throbbing from the fall. The cold was a physical pain, a crushing weight on his chest. His mustache froze to his beard. By the time he reached the low mound of the Tammik homestead, he was shivering uncontrollably, his mind numb with cold. He saw the impossible reality of the ice-free roof, a dark patch of sanity in a glittering white madhouse, but his brain was too frozen to process the implication. He stumbled to the wooden door and knocked, his gloved fist making a dull, hollow sound. The door opened, and Mihkel Tammik stood there. He simply looked at the adjuster for a moment, then stepped back and gestured for him to enter. Halverson braced himself. He expected to be trading the sharp, dry cold of the outside for the damp, clammy chill of a cellar. He expected the smell of earth and mildew. He stepped across the threshold, and the world shifted. It wasn't a blast of heat, like from a blacksmith's forge. It was a profound, enveloping stillness. It was warmth without violence, an even, radiant comfort that seemed to emanate from the very air. He stopped, stunned, just inside the door. He pulled off his gloves, his fingers clumsy and numb. The vindication was not a word or an argument. It was a sensation. He reached out and placed his bare palm against the interior corrugated metal wall. He expected a shock of biting cold. Instead, the metal was merely cool, like a river stone in the summer shade. It was not stealing his heat. It was simply there. All the aggressive, life-stealing cold of the prairie had been stopped somewhere out in the meters of soil he had just walked over. Elena Tammik was at the stove, but she turned and offered him a warm mug of chicory coffee. He took it with trembling hands. On the table, he saw a sight that broke through his frozen fatigue. It was a large glass jar filled with dark sorghum molasses. Alina picked it up to move it aside, and the thick, amber liquid swirled slowly inside. Halverson stared. "The sorghum," he said, his voice hoarse. "At my home, my wife's is frozen solid. She has to chip it out with an ice pick. Every jar in the township is a frozen brick." Alina smiled and took a biscuit from a basket. She spooned a generous dollop of the slow, amber sorghum onto it and handed it to him. The simple, domestic act was more powerful than any blueprint or legal argument. It was proof. It was life, uninterrupted. Halverson sat at their table for a long time, soaking in the impossible warmth. He looked at the healthy children, the calm sufficiency of the room, the tiny, efficient fire in the stove. He looked at Mihkel, this quiet man who had refused to argue, who had simply built his truth into the ground. Finally, he looked at the curving walls, the way they held the space like cupped hands. "Tammik," he said, his voice full of a new and profound respect. He searched for the right words to describe what he was feeling, what he was seeing. "You didn't build a house. You built a harbor." Cleavon Halverson returned to his office in Huron, not as a claim adjuster, but as a convert. He thawed his inkwell on his own pot-bellied stove, the office barely warmer than the street outside, and began to write the most unusual report of his career. He described the failure of the axle, his desperate walk, and his arrival at the Tammik homestead. But he went beyond mere anecdote. He had taken temperature readings. He noted the exterior temperature of -24 degrees Fahrenheit and the sustained interior temperature of 65 degrees. He detailed the minimal size of the fire, estimating the fuel consumption at less than a quarter of a conventional home. He described the bare roof in the midst of the ice storm. He wrote about the unfrozen sorghum. Then he made his radical proposal. He argued that the Homestead Act's requirement for a habitable dwelling had been misinterpreted. It was not about wall height or construction material. It was about performance. A dwelling, he wrote, is habitable if it protects its occupants from the elements in an efficient and sustainable manner. A house that maintains an interior temperature of 65 degrees in a blizzard while consuming minimal fuel is, by any rational definition, more habitable than a code-compliant frame house that can barely stay above freezing and consumes a cord of wood a week. He proposed a new standard for his company's valuations. Habitability would be measured by interior temperature and fuel efficiency, not by arbitrary architectural rules. His superiors, pragmatic men who were tired of underwriting loans on structures that failed in their first winter, were intrigued. Halverson's report, backed by his meticulous data and first-hand testimony, was compelling. They approved his recommendation for the Tammik claim, and then cautiously, they adopted his new standard as a guideline for 3 counties in the James River Valley. Within a year, land offices were providing new settlers with pamphlets that included plans for Tammik-style earth-sheltered dwellings. The idea, born of Estonian memory and forged in a Dakota winter, began to spread. What Mihkel Tammik accomplished on that windswept quarter section in 1903 was more than just building a warm house. He was demonstrating a principle that architects and engineers would rediscover nearly a century later. His half-buried Quonset was a direct ancestor of modern earth-sheltered housing, passive home design, and the core tenets of sustainable architecture. He understood, without formal training, the immense power of thermal mass, the elegant efficiency of working with the environment rather than against it. His simple, powerful design anticipated concepts that would one day have complex names and be calculated by computers. But the truth of it was always there, waiting just a few feet below the prairie grass. The story of the American frontier is often told as a story of conquest, of taming a wild land. It's a narrative of bigger plows, taller windmills, and stronger fences, a story of imposing human will upon the landscape. But perhaps the most profound stories of survival are not about conquest, but about listening. The prairie is not an enemy to be defeated with bigger fires and thicker walls. It is a vast and powerful system, with its own rules and its own deep hidden strengths. Mihkel Tammik survived and thrived, not because he fought the Dakota winter, but because he found the one part of the Dakota that was not at war, the deep, quiet, ever-constant earth beneath it. He saw the prairie not as a surface to be built upon, but as a partner to be embraced. He didn't raise a house against the prairie. He asked it to hold one. Thank you for joining us for this story of frontier ingenuity. If you believe these forgotten histories deserve to be told, please support our work by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Let us know in the comments what other historical innovations you'd be interested in learning about. The video you have just watched presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, but the techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices. Should you consider any modern application of these methods, it is essential to consult with qualified professionals and adhere to all current building codes, safety guidelines, and local regulations. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.